The dinner rush at the bistro was always the same mix of chaos and routine. It was the kind of place where the lights were kept dim to hide the wear on the tables and the noise level was just high enough to keep people from overhearing their neighbors. Everyone had a job to do, and nobody did theirs with more quiet efficiency than the young woman working the floor tables. She was a fixture there, a constant presence in a black uniform that had faded slightly from too many washes. Her hair was pulled back tight, kept out of her face so she could move quickly. She didn't have the bright, loud energy that some servers used to get better tips. She didn't tell jokes or ask about people's days unless they spoke first. She simply moved. She carried heavy trays of steaming pasta and chilled salads as if they weighed nothing, weaving through the crowded aisles without spilling a drop. Most of the regulars didn't know her name. To them, she was just the quiet girl or the server with the sad eyes. She preferred it that way. Being invisible meant she could do her job and go home. It meant she didn't have to answer questions about where she was from or what she wanted to do with her life. She could just exist in the background, a blur of motion clearing plates and filling water glasses. In the far corner of the main dining room, standing like a piece of furniture that everyone forgot about, sat a baby grand piano. It was a beautiful instrument, or at least it had been once. Now, it was mostly a shelf. The glossy black surface was usually buried under a pile of winter coats, discarded purses, and sometimes the extra boxes of napkins the manager couldn't find space for in the back. A small sign on it read "Please do not touch," but that was mostly to keep the children from banging on the keys while their parents waited for a table. The young woman hated walking past that corner. Every time she cleared a table near it, she would feel a strange tightness in her chest. She would keep her eyes strictly on the dirty dishes, refusing to let her gaze drift toward the keyboard. It wasn't just that the piano was being neglected, it was that it was silent. That silence seemed to mock her every time she walked by. What the diners didn't know, and what she would never tell them, was that she hadn't always been a waitress carrying heavy trays. There was a time, not so many years ago, when her hands were meant for something else. She had grown up with music in her home. It wasn't a hobby, it was as essential as breathing. Her days had been structured around practice, her fingers dancing over ivory keys, learning to speak a language that didn't need words. But life has a way of changing the music. A series of events too painful to revisit had stolen the joy from it. The death of someone who understood the language of her soul had turned every song into a funeral march. Every time she touched a key, she didn't hear the note, she heard the absence of the person who used to listen. So, she had stopped. She promised herself she would never play again. She traded the piano bench for a serving tray and decided that a quiet, gray life was better than one filled with beautiful but painful memories. She worked hard to keep that promise. She kept her head down. She focused on the clatter of silverware and the smell of coffee. She avoided the radio in the kitchen if the songs were too slow. She built walls around the part of her heart that used to create music, hoping that if she ignored it long enough, the urge to play would eventually fade away completely. On this particular Tuesday evening, the restaurant was busier than usual. It was cold outside, and people were looking for warmth and comfort food. The air inside smelled like garlic bread and roasted chicken. The young woman was tired. Her feet hurt, and a dull ache had settled between her shoulder blades from carrying a particularly heavy order of ribs to a table in the back. She was wiping down a table near the window when she saw a new customer walk in. He was an older man, probably in his 60s, wearing a coat that looked like it had seen better days but was still well made. He had silver hair and a face that looked like it was used to studying things closely. He didn't have a reservation, but he didn't seem to mind the wait. He stood near the entrance for a moment, ignoring the host who tried to greet him. His eyes were scanning the room, but he wasn't looking for a table. He was looking at the architecture, the lighting, and finally, his gaze landed on the corner. He spotted the piano, buried under a pile of someone's shopping bags and a bulky winter coat. The waitress watched him from the corner of her eye. She saw the frown on his face. It wasn't a look of anger, it was a look of disappointment, like he had walked into a library and found people shouting. He walked past the host stand, heading straight for the instrument. She turned away, hoping he wasn't going to be trouble. She grabbed a pitcher of water and headed to the center of the room to refill some glasses, trying to look busy. She could hear him moving behind her, the sound of shopping bags being rustled. "Excuse me," a deep voice said. She stopped and turned around. The man was standing by the piano, clearing the coats and bags off the bench. He was looking right at her. "I'm sorry," she said automatically, her voice soft. "Can I help you find a table?" The man shook his head. He gestured toward the bench. "Is anyone sitting here?" She blinked, confused. "That's the piano, sir. People just put their things there." "I know," he said. He lifted a heavy coat off the glossy lid and folded it over his arm, handing it to the woman who had just come back from the restroom, looking annoyed. The man didn't seem to notice the annoyance. He was focused on the instrument. "It's a shame to see a beast like this treated like a coat rack," he said, running a hand along the side of the piano. He looked up at the waitress again, his eyes sharp and analyzing. "Does anyone here play it?" The young woman felt a familiar cold feeling in her stomach. She gripped the water pitcher tighter. "No, sir. It's mostly for decoration. We don't have music here." "No music?" he repeated. He sounded genuinely surprised. "A restaurant this size, with a stage like that, and no music?" "It gets too loud," she lied, trying to keep her voice steady. "People like to talk." The man hummed to himself, unconvinced. He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and wiped a layer of dust off the music rack. "My name is Arthur," he said. He didn't offer a hand to shake, he just stood there, claiming the space. "I travel around. I fix things. Old things. Mostly instruments." She nodded politely, taking a small step back, signaling that she needed to get back to work. "That's nice, Arthur. I'll let the host know you need a table." "I don't need a table yet," he said. He sat down on the bench. The bench let out a small creak under his weight. He looked at the keys, which were slightly yellowed with age. He hovered his fingers over them, not pressing down yet. The waitress froze. She felt the urge to run. Every instinct was telling her to go to the kitchen, to check on the soup, to do anything but stand there and watch this man touch the piano. "Do you know what this is?" Arthur asked, looking at the keys. "It's a piano," she whispered. "It's a Steinway," he said. "Probably from the 60s. Look at the way the legs are carved. This was built to sing in a concert hall, not to hold purses in a diner." He looked up at her, and for the first time, his expression softened. "It's lonely," he said. "An instrument like this gets lonely when it's silent." She didn't know what to say. She felt a lump forming in her throat. She looked at his hands, rough, worker's hands with swollen knuckles. They were hands that looked like they knew hard labor. Arthur pressed a key. A low, dull G note sounded out. It was badly out of tune, slightly jarring in the noisy room, but it cut through the clatter of dishes. A few people nearby stopped talking for a second to look over, then went back to their meals. "Terrible tuning," Arthur muttered, mostly to himself. "But the tone is there. Deep down, it's still there." He looked at the waitress again, really looking at her this time. He studied her face, the way she held her shoulders, the way she hid her hands behind the water pitcher. He noticed the calluses on her fingertips, not the kind you get from labor, but the kind you get from pressing down on strings for hours. "I saw you watching me," he said gently. "You looked terrified." "I'm not terrified," she said quickly, her voice rising just a fraction. "I'm just busy. I have customers." "You have the hands of a player," he said, ignoring her excuse. "You hide them, but I can tell. You hold yourself like someone who is trying to take up as little space as possible. Artists do that when they stop creating." The room felt suddenly very small. The noise of the restaurant seemed to fade away, leaving just the hum of the refrigerator and the sound of her own heartbeat in her ears. "I don't play," she said. The words felt like stones in her mouth. "I haven't in years." "I have no idea what you're talking about." Arthur didn't argue. He just smiled a knowing, grandfatherly smile. He slid down the bench, leaving the right side of the piano empty. He patted the empty space beside him. "Prove it," he said. "Just one note. If you haven't played in years, you won't be able to find middle C without looking." She stared at him. She felt the eyes of the room drifting toward them again. A couple at the next table had stopped eating to watch. The bartender paused with a glass in his hand. This was a disruption. This was dangerous. "I can't," she said. Her voice wasn't a whisper anymore, it was a plea. "Please. Don't." "Why?" Arthur asked. He wasn't unkind, but he wasn't moving. He was an immovable object in the path of her carefully planned life. Music isn't something you can just kill. It's part of you. Why punish the piano because you're hurting? The words hit her like a physical blow. Because you're hurting. He didn't know her. He didn't know the funerals, the silence of the apartment, the nights she spent staring at the ceiling. He didn't know the promise she made. "I have to go," she said. She turned on her heel, walking as fast as she could without running. She headed for the kitchen, the swinging doors offering her only escape. She could feel Arthur's eyes on her back, watching her retreat. She thought that would be the end of it. She thought she could hide in the back for 10 minutes, compose herself, and come back out to find he had taken a table or left. But as she pushed through the doors into the chaos of the kitchen, she realized her hands were shaking. She looked down at them, the hands that had once played complicated sonatas without thinking. They were trembling against the handle of the water pitcher. For the first time in years, the silence in her head was loud. And somewhere, in the distance of her memory, she heard a melody that she thought she had buried forever. She knew she couldn't go back out there. But she also knew she couldn't stay in here. The piano was calling, and Arthur was sitting there, waiting, daring her to remember who she used to be. The kitchen was chaotic and hot, a stark contrast to the cool, dim dining room she had just fled. Chefs were shouting orders, pots were clanging, and the smell of garlic and seared meat hung heavy in the air. Usually, this noise was a comfort. It was a wall of sound that blocked out her own thoughts. But tonight, it didn't help. She could still hear the sound of that single, out-of-tune note the man had played. It echoed in her mind, cutting through the sizzle of the grill and the slam of the oven doors. She stood by the stainless steel prep table, gripping the edge so hard her knuckles turned white. She took deep, shaky breaths, trying to push down the panic rising in her chest. She felt like she had been caught doing something wrong, even though she hadn't broken any rules. She had just been seen. Really seen. And that was more terrifying than any angry customer or dropped tray. "Hey, you okay?" a line cook asked, pausing as he chopped a pile of lettuce. He looked at her with mild concern. "You look like you saw a ghost." "I'm fine," she lied, turning away to grab a rag to wipe down a counter. She needed to get back out there. She couldn't hide in the kitchen all night, she had tables to serve. "Just a headache." "It's busy out there." "Yeah, Tuesdays are getting weird," the cook shrugged and went back to work. She stayed there for another minute, staring at the tiles on the floor. She tried to reason with herself. The man was just a stranger. He was an eccentric old guy who liked pianos. He would sit there, maybe realize nobody was going to play, eat his dinner, and leave. She just had to avoid the corner table. It was a big restaurant. She could send the busboy over to refill his water. She could pretend he didn't exist. With a final deep breath, she straightened her apron and pushed through the swinging doors. The noise of the restaurant washed over her again, but it felt different now. The air felt charged. She scanned the room, her eyes darting nervously toward the corner. Arthur was still there. He hadn't moved. He wasn't looking at the menu, and he wasn't looking at the other customers. He was sitting on the piano bench, facing outward, just watching the room with a calm, patient expression. It was like he was a statue placed in the middle of the chaos, waiting for the right moment to come alive. The pile of coats and bags she had seen earlier had been moved to the floor nearby, leaving the piano looking surprisingly bare and dignified. She turned her eyes away quickly. She grabbed a pitcher of iced tea from the service station and headed to the far side of the room, a table as far away from the piano as possible. She forced a smile onto her face as she approached a young couple laughing over appetizers. "More tea?" she asked, her voice sounding strained to her own ears. "Yes, please," the woman said. As she poured, she could feel the weight of Arthur's gaze. She didn't have to look to know he was watching her. It wasn't a creepy stare, it was a focused, studying look. She felt exposed, as if he could see the scars on her heart that were hidden under her uniform. She finished pouring and practically ran back to the kitchen, her heart hammering against her ribs. For the next 20 minutes, she played a dangerous game of hide and seek. She took orders, delivered food, and cleared plates, but she used the other servers and the busboys as shields. She asked a co-worker to take the order for the table by the window so she wouldn't have to pass Arthur. She felt ridiculous. This was her job. She was a grown woman. Why was she letting an old man scare her? But it wasn't fear exactly. It was grief. He had poked a hole in the dam she had built to hold back her memories, and now the water was leaking out. Every time she looked at the corner of her eye, she didn't just see a piano, she saw the living room of her childhood. She saw the sunlight streaming through the curtains, dust motes dancing in the air, and the hands of the person she missed most, guiding her fingers over the keys. Finally, the inevitable happened. The host, a young guy who was just doing his job and didn't know about the silent war going on, flagged her down. "Hey, table 4 hasn't ordered yet," the host said, looking at his computer screen. "They've been sitting there for a while. It's that older guy by the piano. Can you go check on him?" She froze. She looked over at table 4. Arthur was sitting there, looking at his watch. He wasn't impatient. He was just waiting. I'm really busy, she stammered. Can Mark take it? Mark is on break, the host said, already walking away to seat a new group of people at the door. Just get his drink order. Thanks. She cursed under her breath, so softly that no one could hear. She grabbed a notepad and a pen. She felt like she was walking to the gallows. She smoothed her hair, took a breath, and walked toward the corner. As she got closer, she could see the details of the piano up close. The dust on the fallboard was thick, meaning no one had opened it in months. There was a small crack in the music rack. It looked tired, and for the first time, she felt a pang of sympathy for the instrument. It was just like her built for something beautiful, stuck in a place where no one appreciated it. Arthur looked up as she approached. He didn't smile triumphantly. He didn't say "I told you so." He just looked at her with those kind, knowing eyes. He had a glass of water on the table, and his hands were resting on his knees. "Hello again," he said. His voice was low and gravelly, like the sound of a cello bow hitting a string. "Can I take your order?" she asked. She stared at her notepad, refusing to meet his eyes. She gripped the pen so tightly the tip was digging into her thumb. "I'm not very hungry," Arthur said. "But I would like to ask you a question." "We have a special on the salmon tonight," she said robotically, trying to keep him on track. "And the lasagna is good." "You're avoiding me," he said. It wasn't an accusation, just a fact. "Why?" She finally looked at him. He looked harmless, really. Just an old man in a worn coat. But his presence was overwhelming. "Sir, I'm working. I have other tables. Please, just order something or let me go." Arthur sighed. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "You know, when I was a young man, I thought I could fix everything. If a piano was out of tune, I tuned it. If a key was stuck, I fixed the hammer. I thought mechanics were the answer to everything." He paused, looking at her hands holding the notepad. "But I learned something," he continued. "Instruments have souls. They hold on to the people who play them. That piano over there." He gestured with his chin toward the glossy black monster beside him, "It's screaming for attention. But it's not just the piano that's silent, is it?" She felt a tear prick the corner of her eye. She blinked it away furiously. She didn't want to have this conversation. "Not here. Not ever." "I don't know what you're talking about," she whispered. "I'm going to send someone else over." She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "I heard you play once. A long time ago." She froze mid-step. Her heart stopped beating. Slowly, she turned back around. The fear in her eyes was plain now, naked for the whole room to see. "What? That's impossible. I don't know you." "I travel a lot," Arthur said gently. "About 6 years ago, there was a recital at the City College. I was there tuning the Steinway on the main stage. The headliner cancelled last minute. A student filled in. A young woman. She played Chopin. No, it wasn't just playing. She bled onto the keys. It was the most beautiful, heartbreaking thing I've ever heard." The room began to spin. 6 years ago. That was before. Before the accident. Before the silence. She had filled in for a sick friend. It was the last time she had ever played in public. She remembered the fear, but also the strange relief of letting the music take over. She stared at him, her mouth slightly open. He remembered her of all the people in the world. This stranger remembered a 20-minute performance from 6 years ago. It wasn't me, she lied, but her voice lacked conviction. It was you, Arthur said. I never forget hands like that. You have a gift. A gift like that isn't given by accident. It's meant to be shared. Why are you wasting it carrying trays? The question hung in the air between them. Why was she wasting it? She looked around the restaurant. The noise, the clatter, the meaningless conversations. She felt hollow inside. She had worked so hard to be normal, to be safe. But Arthur was making her realize that safety wasn't the same thing as being alive. I had my reasons, she said, her voice cracking. You don't know me. You don't know what happened. You're right, Arthur agreed. I don't know what happened. But I know what happens to talent when you bury it. It turns into poison. It eats you up from the inside. I can see it in your face. You're exhausted, not from the work, but from the hiding. He looked down at his hands, then back up at her. He wasn't forcing her. He wasn't demanding she play. He was just holding up a mirror, showing her the truth she had been running from for years. I'm just a technician, he said softly. I can fix the hammers and the strings. But you're the only one who can make it sing again. She stood there, paralyzed. The sounds of the restaurant seemed to fade away into a dull hum. She looked at the piano. It wasn't a code rack anymore. It was a grave marker for a part of herself that she had murdered. But graves could be opened. The dead could be called back, if only for a moment. She looked at Arthur. He wasn't going to leave. He wasn't going to order salmon. He was going to sit there until she acknowledged the truth. And the scary part was, a small, tiny part of her wanted to sit down. She wanted to feel the keys under her fingers. She wanted to stop hiding. I can't, she said, the words barely audible. I'm too rusty. I'm not that girl anymore. Arthur shrugged. Musicians aren't like athletes. We don't lose our muscles in our arms. We lose them in our heads. Sit down. Just touch it. If it sounds terrible, I'll stop pestering you. I'll order the lasagna and leave you alone. It was a trap. She knew it was a trap. If she sat down, the walls would come down. If she sat down, she would have to feel everything she had been pushing away for 6 years. She looked around the room. People were watching now. A group of college students had stopped texting. The manager was looking over from the host stand with a curious expression. The pressure was mounting. The air in the room felt heavy, thick with anticipation. She felt like she was standing on a ledge, and the only way to go was down. Or maybe, the only way was to jump. She took a shaky step closer to the piano. The black and white keys stared up at her, silent and judging. They were just ivory and wood, plastic and felt. They were harmless. But to her, they were everything. Arthur slid a few inches to the left, leaving the center of the bench open. He didn't say a word. He just waited. She put her notepad in her apron pocket. Her hand trembled as she reached out toward the instrument. She didn't sit down yet. She just hovered her hand over the keys, terrified to make contact. She felt the eyes of the entire room burning into her back. This was a mistake. She was going to embarrass herself. She was going to cry. But Arthur just sat there, a solid, comforting presence beside her. He was a bridge to the life she had left behind. And for some reason, she trusted him. Just one note, she whispered to herself, repeating his words from earlier. Just to make him leave. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes for a split second, and let her fingers drop. They didn't hit middle C. They hit a chord. A complex, painful, familiar chord that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards and up into her heart. The sound wasn't perfect. It was jarring and loud in the quiet room. But it was real. And as the sound faded into the air, she knew she wasn't going to be able to walk away. The sound that came out of the piano wasn't graceful, it was jagged and sudden, crashing through the low hum of the restaurant like a glass plate breaking on a hard floor. It was a jarring C minor chord, struck hard enough to make the old strings rattle. For a split second, the young woman froze, her hands still hovering over the keys, terrified that she had broken something or made a fool of herself. She expected people to laugh. She expected someone to tell her to be quiet. But the laughter never came. Instead, a heavy, absolute silence fell over the room. It started in the immediate area around the piano and rippled outward like a shock wave. The clatter of silverware against plates ceased. The murmurs of conversation from the booths died out. Even the noise from the open kitchen window seemed to lower, as if the chefs had paused their work to listen. The air in the restaurant, usually thick with the smells of food and the sounds of daily life, suddenly felt thin and charged, like the atmosphere just before a storm. She kept her head down, staring at her hands. They didn't look like her hands. They looked alien to her, pale against the black and white keys. She waited for Arthur to speak, to say "I told you so" or to make some joke about her rustiness. But the old man didn't say a word. He just sat there on the bench, his hands resting calmly on his lap, acting as a silent anchor in the middle of the chaotic storm of her emotions. "Sit properly," Arthur said finally. His voice was barely a whisper, but in the silence of the room, it carried the weight of a shout. The command was gentle, but it was a command nonetheless. She felt her legs obey before her brain could protest. She lowered herself onto the bench. The wood was hard and cold against her legs. She felt incredibly small. The piano, which had looked like a piece of furniture a few minutes ago, now loomed over her like a giant beast. It felt alive. She could feel the vibrations of the chord she had just played fading away, echoing in the wood beneath her. She could feel the eyes of the customers. They weren't hostile eyes, they were curious eyes. People at the nearby tables had turned their chairs slightly. A man holding a fork halfway to his mouth had stopped eating. Two teenagers who had been looking at their phones had lowered them to stare. She was the center of attention, and it was her worst nightmare come true. Her heart hammered against her ribs so hard she thought the people sitting closest might hear it. "I can't do this," she whispered to Arthur. She started to pull her hands away, retreating back into her shell. "Everyone is looking." "Let them look," Arthur said, not turning his head. He kept his eyes fixed on the music rack. "They are looking because they feel the shift in the room. They know something important is happening. They are hungry, but not for the food anymore. They are waiting for the truth." "The truth?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I'm just a waitress. I'm just trying to get through my shift." "No," Arthur shook his head slowly. "That's the costume you wear. The truth is what's in your hands. The truth is why you hit that chord so hard. You're angry. You're sad. And you have nowhere to put it except into this instrument." He was right. It made her angry, the way he saw right through her defenses. It made her angry that he had dragged her out of her safe, invisible life and put her on this stage. But beneath the anger was something else. It was a terrifying, bubbling pressure that had been building up inside her for 6 years. It was the grief she had swallowed, the melodies she had silenced, the part of her soul that had been screaming to be heard. She looked at the keys again. They were dirty. A few of the white keys had small chips near the front. The black keys were slick with the grease of 1,000 unknowing hands. It was a neglected instrument, much like she felt she was. And for some reason, that made her feel a sudden surge of affection for it. It was a wounded thing, just like her. Just play, Arthur urged softly. Don't think about a song. Don't think about scales. Just think about the voice you haven't used in years. Give it one word. Just one word. She closed her eyes. She tried to empty her mind of the customers, the restaurant, the fear, and the old man sitting next to her. She reached back into the dark corners of her memory, trying to find the feeling she used to get when she played. She remembered the feeling of the sun on her face when she was a child. She remembered the sound of laughter in a house that was now quiet. Her right hand lifted. It felt heavy, like it was made of lead. She didn't know what she was going to play. She didn't have a sheet of music in front of her. She just let her fingers fall. They landed on an E note. Then a G. Then a high, piercing E that rang out clear and bright. It wasn't a song yet. It was just notes. Disconnected, wandering notes. But as she played them, she felt a strange sensation in her chest. It was like a tight knot beginning to loosen. The sound of the piano, even out of tune and dusty, was physical. She felt the vibrations travel up her fingertips, through her wrists, and into her arms. It was an electric shock, waking up nerves that had been asleep for years. She played a descending run, her fingers fumbling slightly on the keys. She missed a note, hitting a clunker that sounded discordant and harsh. She flinched, waiting for the room to groan. But no one moved. The silence just deepened. The audience was holding its breath, willing her to keep going despite the mistake. They weren't judging her technique, they were hooked by the rawness of the moment. Arthur shifted beside her. He reached out and adjusted the damper pedal with his foot, holding it down slightly. The sound of the notes suddenly bloomed, becoming richer and fuller. "Don't stop," he murmured. "Keep talking to it." She took a shaky breath. The fumble had actually helped. It broke the spell of perfectionism. She wasn't performing a concerto, she was just making noise. And because it wasn't perfect, it was real. She started to play a melody she hadn't thought of in years, an old folk song she used to play with her mother. It was a simple tune, repetitive and sad. As the melody formed, the change in the room was palpable. The restless energy of the diners turned into a focused stillness. A young mother in the corner put her hand on her sleeping baby's stroller, rocking it gently in time with the slow rhythm. A businessman in a suit loosened his tie, his eyes closing as the music washed over him. The music was filling the empty spaces between the tables, weaving a spell that turned a greasy spoon into a cathedral. The young woman felt tears stinging her eyes, but she didn't wipe them away. She was too scared to stop playing. She felt like she was walking a tightrope. If she stopped, the magic would break, and she would just be a waitress in a tired uniform again. If she kept playing, she could stay in this world where emotions were allowed to exist. Her left hand, which had been resting awkwardly in her lap, found the lower keys. It began to play bass notes, deep, resonant tones that supported the simple melody in her right hand. It wasn't technically difficult, but the sound was full of a longing so deep it hurt to listen to. She was playing the goodbye she never got to say. She was playing the love she still carried but couldn't express. Arthur sat perfectly still. He had become part of the furniture, a silent guardian. He watched the patrons, not the pianist. He saw the hard lines on people's faces soften. He saw the tension leave their shoulders. He knew that music was the only language that could bypass the brain and speak directly to the heart, and he had just unlocked the door. The pressure was still there, crushing her chest, but now it was fueling the music. She played harder. The piano, which had been silent for so long, seemed to wake up. The sound grew louder, filling every corner of the room. The strings vibrated against the soundboard, singing with a voice that was surprisingly strong for an instrument that had been neglected. She didn't look up. She couldn't bear to see the looks on their faces. She just stared at the dancing dust motes in the beam of light above the piano, letting her fingers trace the path of her history. Every note was a memory. Every chord was a regret. She was bleeding out onto the keys, and the strange thing was, it didn't kill her. It was making her feel alive again. The music swelled, rising to a crescendo that made the water glasses on the tables tremble. It was a cry of pain, but it was also a declaration of survival. She was here. She was broken, but she was here. And for the first time in 6 years, she wasn't hiding. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the melody seemed to run out of breath. Her hands slowed down. The complex chords simplified back to single notes. She played a final, resolving chord, a gentle C major that floated in the air like a benediction. She held her hands down on the keys, letting the sound sustain, feeling the vibrations dying away slowly, second by second. When the last echo finally faded into the silence of the room, she didn't pull her hands away immediately. She sat there, shoulders slumped, her chest heaving as if she had just run a marathon. She was terrified to lift her hands. She was terrified to turn around and face the room, to see if they were laughing, or staring, or judging. The silence that followed was different from the silence before. Before, it was a lack of sound. Now, it was a presence. It was a heavy, reverent hush that felt like a physical weight. No one applauded. No one spoke. They just sat there, stunned by the raw humanity of what they had just witnessed. The waitress had just poured her soul out in public, and they were all witnesses to her vulnerability. Arthur shifted beside her. He leaned in close, his voice barely breaking the stillness. "You're still here," he whispered. She took a ragged breath and finally lifted her hands from the keys. As she pulled them back, she felt like she was leaving a piece of herself behind on the ivory. She didn't know if she could ever stand up and walk back to her tables. She didn't know who she was anymore. The quiet girl was gone, and she didn't know what was left in her place. She slowly turned her head to look at Arthur. His eyes were wet with tears, but he was smiling. It was a smile of profound respect. And beyond him, in the shadows of the restaurant, she saw the faces of the customers. They weren't looking at her with pity. They were looking at her with a kind of awe, as if they had just watched a miracle happen in the middle of a Tuesday dinner rush. The spell wasn't broken, but it had changed. The wall between her and the rest of the world had been shattered. She sat on the piano bench, exposed and shaking, waiting for the courage to step back into her life. The silence in the room was heavy, but it wasn't the uncomfortable kind that makes people shuffle their feet or look at their watches. It was a stunned, sacred silence. It felt like the air pressure had changed, as if the music had been holding up the roof of the restaurant, and now that the sound had stopped, everyone was holding their breath to keep the sky from falling in. The young woman sat on the bench, her back rigid, staring at the keys she had just touched. Her hands were resting in her lap, trembling so violently that she had to clasp them together to keep them still. She felt a strange mix of terror and relief. The noise that had been screaming inside her head for 6 years had finally gone quiet. In its place was a dull ache, but it was a clean kind of pain, like the soreness after a long workout rather than the sharp, stabbing pain of a fresh wound. She had opened the door to the room she kept locked in her mind, and instead of a monster coming out to eat her alive, music had come out. She felt lighter, as if she had physically lost weight in the last 10 minutes. Arthur shifted beside her. The sound of the old bench squeaking under his movement seemed deafening in the quiet room. He didn't look at her immediately, he kept his eyes on the piano, his fingers gently tracing the wood near the keys. He treated the instrument with the same reverence one might show a tired racehorse that had just run its final race. He seemed to be giving her a moment, a pocket of time where she didn't have to be a person yet. She could just be a pair of hands that had made a sound. Slowly, the young woman became aware of her surroundings again. She heard the hum of the large refrigerator in the kitchen. She smelled the garlic bread that was starting to burn under the heat lamps because the cooks had stopped watching the food. She felt the draft from the air conditioning vent blowing onto her neck. Reality was trying to creep back in. She knew she had to move. She had to stand up and walk back to the service station. She had to pick up her notepad and refill water glasses. But her legs felt like lead. She was paralyzed by the thought of turning around and seeing the faces of the people she served every day. She was terrified of what she would see in their eyes. Would they look at her with pity? Would they think she was showing off? Or worse, would they just look at her like she was a stranger, realizing they never really knew the person who brought them their coffee? Arthur turned to her then. He didn't say anything at first. He just reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder. His hand was warm and rough, a grounding weight in the middle of her spinning world. He gave her a gentle squeeze, not pushing her toward the audience, but just letting her know he was there. "You let it out," he whispered. His voice was gruff, like sandpaper, but his eyes were soft. "It's done now. You can breathe again." The young woman took a shuddering breath. It felt like the first real breath she had taken in years. She nodded, a small, jerky movement. She unclasped her hands and wiped her palms on her apron. They were sweating. She looked at Arthur, and for the first time, she didn't see a nosy old man who was bothering her. She saw someone who had seen her lost in the woods and had offered her a compass. I have to get back to work," she whispered. Her voice sounded hoarse, like she had been screaming instead of playing music. "Work will be there," Arthur said. He patted her shoulder one last time and withdrew his hand. "Don't rush. Let them wait. The food can get cold, but this moment, don't lose it by running away too fast." She wanted to stay. She wanted to sit there and listen to the fading echo of the chord still vibrating in the soundboard. But she knew he was right. She couldn't hide on the bench forever, she had to face the room. She gripped the edge of the bench and pushed herself up. Her knees felt weak, threatening to buckle, but she locked them and forced herself to stand. She smoothed the front of her uniform, a nervous habit she had developed years ago. She felt exposed. She felt like she was standing on a stage without any clothes on, even though she was fully covered. She turned around slowly. The sight that met her eyes made her freeze again. The restaurant was full, but it looked completely different than it had 20 minutes ago. The tables were still there, the chairs were still occupied, but the energy had completely shifted. Nobody was eating. Every single person in the dining room was looking at her. At the table nearest to the piano, A man in a business suit had completely forgotten about the steak on his plate. His knife and fork were resting on the table, and his mouth was slightly open. He wasn't looking at her with judgment, he was looking at her with total shock. It was as if he expected the piano to start talking. A few tables back, a young couple sat holding hands across the table. The woman had tears streaming down her face, smearing her makeup, but she didn't seem to care. She was looking at the young woman with a kind of deep empathy, as if the music had unlocked a sadness in her own life. The busboy, a guy she worked with every day who usually spent his shifts flirting and joking around, was standing near the kitchen doors holding a tub of dirty dishes. He was just staring, his mouth shut, his eyes wide. He looked like he was seeing a ghost. The young woman felt her face burning hot. She lowered her eyes, unable to handle the intensity of their gazes. She felt a strong urge to run, to bolt through the kitchen doors and out the back exit into the alleyway. She wanted to escape the heavy weight of their attention. It was too much. It was too raw. She had shared something private and painful, and now it was hanging in the air for everyone to dissect. She took a tentative step away from the piano. Her footfalls felt loud on the carpet. Then, something happened that she didn't expect. From the back of the room, near the large windows, an older man slowly stood up. He was wearing a plaid shirt and had a beard speckled with gray. He didn't say anything. He just looked at the young woman, nodded once, a slow, respectful nod, and then gently clapped his hands together. Clap. It wasn't a clap of entertainment. It wasn't the applause you give after a concert where you are saying good job. It was quieter than that. It was a clap of recognition. It was him saying, "I hear you. I see you." Another person, a woman in a booth near the kitchen, stood up and joined in. Then the businessman with the steak. Then the couple holding hands. Soon, the whole room was rising to their feet. The applause started slow. It wasn't a roar, it was a gentle wave of sound. It was the sound of people paying tribute to something real. It was the sound of a room full of strangers realizing that they had just witnessed a moment of pure, unfiltered humanity. There was no whistling, no shouting, no bravo. Just the rhythmic, thundering sound of hands coming together, washing over the young woman like a warm tide. She stood there, frozen in the center of the circle of sound. She didn't know what to do with her hands. She didn't know if she should bow or if she should run. She felt a tear slide down her cheek, hot and fast. She quickly wiped it away, but another one took its place. She looked over at Arthur. He was still sitting on the bench, watching the crowd. He had a small, satisfied smile on his face. He caught her eye and nodded toward the kitchen. "Go," he mouthed. "You're done here." She nodded. She didn't bow. She didn't wave. She just turned and walked toward the kitchen. As she moved through the aisles, the applause seemed to follow her, a cocoon of sound protecting her from the judgment she had feared. People reached out as she passed, gently touching her arm or offering a smile. They weren't touching the waitress, they were touching the musician. She pushed through the swinging doors into the kitchen. The noise hit her instantly, the clanging of pans, the shouting of orders, the hiss of the grill. It was jarring and harsh compared to the quiet reverence of the dining room. The kitchen staff stopped what they were doing and looked at her. The head chef, a big man who usually barked orders and complained about everything, looked at her red eyes and trembling lip. He didn't yell. He didn't ask why the orders were piling up. He just looked at her for a long moment, then pointed toward the small office in the back. "Take 5, he said gruffly. "Or 10. Go splash some water on your face. We'll cover your tables. Thank you, she whispered. Her voice was so small she almost couldn't hear it herself. She walked to the back of the kitchen and slipped into the small bathroom. She locked the door behind her and leaned against it, letting out a breath she felt like she'd been holding since she sat down at the piano. The bathroom was small and cramped, smelling of industrial cleaner and lemon soap, but it was quiet. She looked at herself in the mirror over the sink. Her eyes were bright and wet. Her face was flushed. Her hair was escaping from her tie. But she didn't look like the same person who had walked into work that morning. The dullness was gone. The emptiness in her eyes had been replaced by a flickering light. She turned on the faucet and splashed cold water on her face. The shock of the cold helped clear her head. She stared at her hands again, the hands that had just coaxed beauty out of a dusty, neglected instrument. She turned them over, looking at the palms, the calluses. They were just hands. But for a few minutes, they had been magic. She knew that nothing was magically fixed. Her past was still her past. The people she had lost were still gone, her job was still hard, and the rent was still due. But something inside the box she had locked away had opened. She had played the music, and the sky hadn't fallen. The world hadn't ended. In fact, for a moment, the world had been beautiful. She took a paper towel and dried her face. She fixed her hair and took a deep breath. She straightened her apron. She didn't know how she was going to go back out there and act normal. She didn't know if she could ever go back to being invisible. But as she unlocked the bathroom door, she realized she didn't want to be invisible anymore. She walked back into the kitchen. The rhythm of the dinner rush had picked up again, but the atmosphere felt lighter. The chefs were moving with energy. The dishwasher was humming. She grabbed a pitcher of water and a new notepad. She pushed through the swinging doors. The applause had died down, and people were talking again, but the tone was different. It was softer, more thoughtful. As she walked onto the floor, heads turned. People smiled at her. Not the polite customer service smile, but genuine, warm smiles. She walked past the piano. Arthur was still there, sitting on the bench. He had ordered the lasagna and was eating it slowly with a fork. He looked up as she passed. He didn't say anything. He just winked at her, a conspiratorial twinkle in his eye. The young woman walked to her first table, a family of 4 who had just finished their appetizers. "Are you ready to order?" she asked. Her voice was still a little shaky, but it was stronger than before. The father looked at her, then at the piano, then back at her. "That was beautiful," he said softly. "Just beautiful." "Thank you." "You're welcome," she said. And for the first time in years, she meant it. The rest of the shift felt like walking through a dream. The young woman moved from table to table, taking orders and refilling glasses, but the world felt different. The air in the restaurant seemed lighter, less heavy than it had before. It was as if the music had acted as a filter, cleaning out the dust and the bad energy that usually accumulated during a busy dinner service. When she looked at the customers, she didn't just see wallets or demands, she saw people. She saw the tiredness in the mother's eyes, the excitement in the child's face, the loneliness in the old man's posture. Everywhere she went, the mood had shifted. People were speaking in softer tones. There was less clattering of silverware, less aggressive chewing. It was a strange, invisible change, like the weather had cleared up indoors without anyone opening a window. She felt a strange mix of exhaustion and adrenaline, like a runner who had just finished a marathon and didn't know whether to collapse or keep running. She kept glancing over at the corner. Arthur was still there. He had finished his lasagna and was now sipping a cup of black coffee. He sat with his back to the room, watching the door, occasionally looking up at the waiter or the host with a polite nod. He looked perfectly content to just sit and exist in the space. He wasn't demanding attention. He had done what he came to do. As the evening wore on, the crowds began to thin out. The dinner rush turned into the late-night lull. The lights in the restaurant were dimmed slightly, signaling the end of the day. The young woman wiped down a table near the window, her movements slow and rhythmic. Her body was tired, her feet ached, and her arms felt heavy from lifting trays, but her mind was incredibly active. She kept hearing the melody she had played, echoing in the back of her mind, repeating over and over like a song stuck on the radio. She walked over to Arthur's table to refill his water. He looked up at her and smiled. It was a soft, knowing smile that didn't need words. "You did good," he said simply, pushing his cup toward her. "I didn't plan it," she said, feeling the need to explain herself, even though he hadn't asked. "I didn't mean to make a scene." "The best things in life aren't planned," Arthur said. He stirred his coffee with a small spoon, the clinking sound gentle against the background noise of the cleaning crew. "If you had planned it, you would have worried about being perfect. You would have tried to impress people. Instead, you just told the truth. And that's why they listened." She looked down at the table, tracing a scratch in the laminate with her finger. "I haven't played like that since before." "I know," Arthur said gently. It sounded like a goodbye. But it also sounded like a hello. "A hello. To yourself," he said. "The part of you that you thought was gone. It's not gone. It was just sleeping." He placed a $10 bill on the table to cover his coffee. It was a generous tip, but he didn't make a big deal about it. He stood up slowly, his joints cracking slightly. He pulled his coat on and buttoned it with care. "Are you leaving?" she asked. She felt a sudden pang of panic. He was the only person in the room who knew her secret. If he left, would the magic fade? Would she go back to being just the quiet girl? "I have a long drive tomorrow," Arthur said. "I need to get some rest." "Will I ever see you again?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. Arthur chuckled, a deep, warm rumble in his chest. "The world is smaller than you think. But you don't need me to play. You have the piano. It's right there." He gestured toward the instrument in the corner. "It's still out of tune. It still needs work. But it's waiting for you." "I don't know if I can," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "It hurts too much." "It will always hurt," Arthur said, his voice serious but kind. "The people we lose leave holes that never heal. But if you stop playing because of the pain, you're letting the silence win. And the silence is much louder than the music." He reached out and patted her hand, the same rough, comforting grip he had used earlier. "Don't let the silence win, kid." He turned and walked toward the glass front doors. The host, who was counting money at the register, looked up and nodded a goodbye. Arthur pushed the door open and stepped out into the night. A gust of cold wind blew into the restaurant, rustling the menus on the host's stand, and then the door swung shut, sealing the warmth inside. The young woman stood there for a long time, looking at the empty space where he had been. She felt a sense of loss, but it wasn't the devastating grief she was used to. It was a bittersweet feeling, like the end of a good book. She finished her shift a half hour later. The manager told her she could leave early, saying she looked tired and that they had things under control. Usually, she would rush home to her small apartment, change into sweatpants, and watch television until she fell asleep, just to numb her mind. But tonight, she didn't want to go home. She didn't want to be alone with her thoughts in a silent room. She took off her apron and hung it on the hook in the break room. She grabbed her coat and her purse, but instead of heading for the exit, she walked back onto the floor. The restaurant was nearly empty now. The lights were turned down low, casting long shadows across the tables. The chairs were flipped up on the tables so the floor crew could mop. The air smelled of disinfectant and coffee. It was peaceful. She walked over to the corner. The piano sat there, waiting. The sign that said "Please do not touch" was still on the music rack, covered in dust. Someone had thrown a coat over the bench again, careless and indifferent. She reached down and picked up the coat, folding it neatly and placing it on a nearby chair. She looked at the instrument. It looked back at her, silent and imposing. She sat down on the bench. It was cold. She flexed her fingers, feeling the stiffness in her joints. She looked at the keys. Up close, they looked messy. Someone had spilled a drop of soda near the high C key, leaving a sticky residue. The fallboard was scratched. It wasn't a stage. It wasn't a concert hall. It was just a tired piano in a diner. She took a deep breath and placed her hands on the keys. She didn't close her eyes this time. She looked around the empty room. She saw the kitchen doors, the register, the booths where people had laughed and cried just hours ago. She pressed a key. A single note. Then another. She didn't play the song from before. She played something simple. A nursery rhyme she remembered from when she was very little. It was a silly, happy tune. It wasn't sad. It wasn't heartbreaking. It was just a song. As she played, she realized that Arthur was right. It still hurt. Her heart still ached with a missing piece that would never return. But the music was bigger than the hurt. The music filled the empty spaces in the room and the empty spaces in her chest. The vibration of the strings hummed through her hands, into her arms, and into her heart. She played for another 10 minutes, letting the notes drift through the quiet restaurant. She made mistakes. She stumbled over the keys. But she didn't stop. She didn't care about being perfect anymore. She just wanted to play. When she finally stopped, the silence didn't feel like an enemy. It felt like a friend. It was the silence that comes after a good conversation, the silence of peace and understanding. She stood up and pushed the bench back in. She looked at the piano one last time. "Good night," she whispered. She walked to the front doors and pushed them open. The night air was crisp and cool, smelling of rain that hadn't fallen yet and exhaust fumes from the street. The city sounds, cars honking, sirens wailing, people talking washed over her. She pulled her coat tighter around herself and began to walk toward the bus stop. Her walk was different now. She didn't shuffle with her head down. She walked with her back straight. She looked at the street lights reflecting off the puddles on the sidewalk. She looked at the faces of the few people passing by. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. She didn't know if she would ever be a famous musician, or if she would even play the piano again. But for the first time in 6 years, she knew who she was. She wasn't just a waitress. She was a musician who had taken a long break. She got on the bus and sat by the window, watching the city lights blur by. She hummed a soft melody, the same simple tune she had played on the piano. It was a quiet sound, lost in the noise of the bus engine. But it was there. And she knew that as long as she could hum, she was going to be okay. The silence hadn't won. She had.